Alright, let's start talking about the respiratory system, and we kind of already know parts of it. We know that it's really designed for gas exchange, oxygen and CO2. That makes a lot of sense. But the air that's coming out of our lungs also help us produce sound by bouncing and flexing our vocal cords, so we can use that too. It helps us for smell and regulates our blood pressure and pH, and it also helps us keep some bad stuff out of our body, and we'll talk about how that happens soon. So respiration is the process of gas exchange, and that's the movement of air into and out of our lungs. And we have different types of respiration that we'll actually come to soon that we'll talk about. And those are external respiration. That's the exchange of air between the air and our blood in our lungs. So this is still just in our lungs, but hasn't gone into our body yet. Internal respiration is exchanged between the blood and the body tissues. So it's captured in the red blood cells itself and now are being deposited to tissues. And then finally, the reason why we do all this gas exchange is for cellular respiration. And you don't need to know it for this exam, but really the big picture is that we need air to help us do cellular respiration, which is another type of metabolism that we do. And without air, we can't produce tons of ATP. But with O2, we can go ahead and keep making ATP and fall through that process. When your cells lack O2, you start to have this thing called lactic acid burn, and it's just because you can't move oxygen fast enough to these organs that are moving really quick, and you feel that burn that a lot of people talk about. So the factors that affect breathing and breath rate is we have the ability to do this thing called chemosensitive areas, and they look for chemical detections and things like that, and really what we're trying to detect is carbon and oxygen and hydrogen levels. So factors that affect breathing levels are going to be rises of CO2 in the body, even outside the body, because we might have to breathe faster or breathe more to try to get the oxygen out of the air that we're breathing in. Low body oxygen, so we need to do that to help us keep doing that cellular respiration. And what we're going to do here is we're going to have the body sort of sense these changes, and the body will adjust to it to make us breathe more. Inflation reflex, that regulates the deep breath and prevents overinflation of our lungs. You can imagine that our lungs are kind of like balloons or maybe even sponges, and you can overload them with air and make them pop. And then, of course, when you're having some sort of emotional response, you're going to have, you breathe more and things like that to help you deal with it. But really, what's going to be the star of the show are going to be these things called alveoli, and they're going to be able to take the air and help us move it into our bloodstream because they're one cell thick, and to protect them, there's going to be some macrophages that pick up those foreign bodies that come in accidentally and sort of clean it up. When we talk about gas exchange or respiratory tracts, we're going to break our respiratory tract into two areas. We're going to have an upper respiratory tract and our lower respiratory tract. And the upper respiratory tract, a lot of this is going to make sense, is the nose, the nasal cavity, the paranasal sinuses, those are those little folds in your nose, and then finally your pharynx. And then we have a lower respiratory tract. That's going to be the larynx itself, the trachea, the bronchi, eventually the bronchi tree, which is basically the primary, secondary, tertiary break-offs of the bronchi, and then finally the lungs. And the big picture here is that we've discussed the heart already, but the blood from the heart is going to go and get to the lungs, break down near these alveoli, and have a capillary exchange where there's going to be CO2 dumped into the lungs. Simultaneously, O2 is going to get picked up by those red blood cells and then return back to the heart. And then the left atrium is going to push it to the left ventricle and kind of get it out the aorta and sort of move it to the rest of the body. But capillaries will start to break them down. The red blood cells will go down to these capillaries and they'll touch all these different cells. And the cells are really what need that gas exchange. They're producing the CO2, but in return, they need the oxygen to kind of be picked up. So let's get started with some areas that help us do this respiratory. And let's start out with the nose. The nose is really designed to warm air, moisten it. That's why you have a lot of mucus in there, and it's designed to give some of that water up to the air going in. It filters, of course, that's what the mucus is there for, as well as the nose hair that we have. Detect odors. When we have odors, we've got to turn them into a liquid so our cells can pick them up and identify them. And then, of course, it's going to help us. It's a chamber, and it helps amplify voice. The conchi itself, that's these little folds that you see inside the nose, those bony protrusions, and they're covered with mucus, and they function to increase surface area, and that's going to help facilitate the warming, the moistening, but really catching some of that material. And then the meatus, that's going to narrow the canal right over here, and that's going to create an area where we can create some turbulence. That turbulence is going to make it so foreign particles will get picked up easier and just contact with the membrane. So the function of the conchi is to increase surface area. The function of the mucous membrane is to warm, moisten, and trap dust particles, and eventually those particles will either get sneezed out or chucked into our stomach. We have 3 different pharynxes, and our pharynx, as we start to go down, we have the nasopharynx. That's going to be from the nose right before we hit the mouth. We have the oropharynx. That's going to be when you breathe in. That's going to be the first point of contact with the mucus and things like that, or at least the respiratory muci. And then we have the laryngopharynx, and that's going to be the division between the larynx and the esophagus, and eventually that's going to go down to our lungs. The sinuses are itself really designed to loosen or reduce the weight of the skull, but they're also designed to help with some of these sounds and picking up some of these odors and moving them up too. The nasal muci, if we're still going down the nose, we're going to go ahead and have the olfactory muci, and they're basically going to be covered with mucus. They're going to have these goblet cells in them that are going to go ahead and not just trap particles, but be able to swallow them and destroy them. They also humidify the air and make it so air is humid for our lungs. If it wasn't humid for our lungs, it might make it harder to breathe. And of course, the lysozymes, they're designed to destroy bacteria cells, anything that looks foreign, and they're going to kind of dump any of that stuff into the bloodstream, destroyed, or dump that stuff into the stomach, destroyed, though. There's 3 parts of the larynx. We've already kind of discussed them. And then we've discussed the vocal folds. We know that the folds don't really help produce sound, but how we tighten them and how air moves on them really dictates pitch and things like that. And then we have an epiglottis. It's kind of like a flap. You saw it in the cadaver. It looks kind of like a tongue. And basically, it's designed to, anytime you swallow water or food, it closes so nothing goes into the trachea, and then opens back up so air can keep going into the lungs. And then finally, the trachea. The trachea is going to be formed by C-shaped cartilagic rings, and they are always open. They act as a scaffolding to always make sure that tube stays open. And behind it would be the esophagus. The esophagus can go ahead and you can see the esophagus here, you can see the trachea here. When you do swallow, you take over a little of this environment and then kind of close back up. It's designed so we can kind of occupy the same area. If we had these both open, it might make it so food from our stomach could potentially come up, so we don't want that. But it's also shared temporarily with the airway passage. That's why you can't breathe and eat at the same time. And then the mucosal escalator, that's going to be these little cilia-like things that are going to catch items, move them only in one direction, which is going to be up or out. And if it's between your nose and kind of your oropharynx, it's going to have you sneeze it out. If it's near your oropharynx, it's going to have you maybe cough it out. More likely, it's going to be from your laryngopharynx to the start of the trees. And it's going to basically keep moving items up, 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 kind of like an escalator, hence the name, and then get it to your stomach, and then kind of have your stomach sort of kill it from there. Great. In our next video, we'll start talking about the lungs.